It started like most neighborly tensions do, not with a confrontation but with a letter. A thin envelope taped to the front door, scrawled in stiff cursive and sealed with passive aggression. The kind of letter that doesn't accuse outright, but implies. It didn't bear an HOA logo or any official markings. Just a message that read, "Your dog has been barking excessively. Please be considerate." For the Morris family, it was as baffling as it was irritating. Their dog, Milo, a well-trained golden retriever with a temperament bordering on sleepy, rarely barked at all. At 4 years old, Milo had grown out of his puppy phase. He spent most of his time napping on the shaded porch or lazily patrolling the backyard fence. If he barked at all, it was a single alert to the mailman or an enthusiastic greeting to neighborhood kids passing by. Nothing excessive. Nothing aggressive. The Morris family shrugged off the note at first. They chalked it up to a misunderstanding. Maybe Milo barked while they were out and they hadn't noticed. Maybe it was a one-time thing. But then came the second complaint. And the third. Each one more curt than the last. Each one unsigned but unmistakably from the same source. The neighbor 2 houses down. Her name was Ms. Cornelia Weller, though everyone in the neighborhood knew her by a different name. Karen. Cornelia was the embodiment of suburban entitlement. Mid-60s, retired, with a perfectly trimmed lawn and an obsession with rules that bordered on pathological. Her garage was lined with laminated HOA guidelines, and her phone held every non-emergency contact number the city had to offer. She lived alone, save for a cat no one had ever seen but which she insisted was a model of quiet companionship. Cornelia had been a thorn in many residents' sides, but she'd taken a particular interest in Milo. She claimed, loudly and often, that the dog barked without end, that it triggered her migraines, and that it was psychologically abusive to be forced to endure such noise in her own home. The Morris family tried to reason. They installed a camera to track Milo's movements. The footage showed what they already knew. Milo hardly barked. In fact, most recordings showed him lying in the grass, bored out of his mind. When they presented this to the HOA, they were told complaints were subjective and not actionable without broader resident support. Cornelia, however, was undeterred. She escalated. She began calling animal control. The first visit was cordial. The officer knocked on the door, asked a few questions, and observed Milo through the fence. He left apologetically, saying someone had filed a complaint about disturbing barking, but admitted he heard nothing of the sort. He filed a non-violation report and left. But it didn't stop there. Over the next few weeks, animal control visited 3 more times. Always during the day. Always when Milo was quietly lounging. The Morris family became increasingly frustrated. It was clear what was happening. Cornelia wasn't responding to noise. She was orchestrating a campaign of harassment. Each complaint was strategically timed. Each one a shot fired not for justice but for control. The final straw came when the Morrises received a formal notice in the mail, an official warning. It cited repeated community reports of excessive barking and warned that further violations could result in fines or even mandated relocation of the animal. That's when something changed in Brian Morris. A usually calm and patient man, Brian had grown up with dogs, worked in IT, and prided himself on avoiding drama. But the injustice of the situation ignited something in him. If Cornelia wanted to play games, then maybe it was time someone else played back. Only this time with strategy. He didn't want revenge in the traditional sense. He didn't want confrontation or a shouting match at the end of her driveway. What he wanted was precision. What he wanted was to beat her at her own game. That night, he sat down at his desk and opened a search tab. He began looking into sound-activated collars, smart training devices, and behavioral conditioning techniques. But what caught his eye was something different, an innovation born out of necessity. Button-activated bark simulators. The idea was simple but brilliant. These devices could emit a pre-recorded dog bark at the press of a discrete remote button. The sound was realistic, varied in tone and length, and best of all, completely controlled by the user. They were marketed for use in guard dog deterrence, prank devices, or even training. But Brian saw something else. A solution. If Cornelia insisted Milo was barking, Then Brian would give her something to complain about. Only this time on his terms. He ordered the device that night, expedited shipping. As the plan formed in his mind, he could feel the tides shifting. No more playing defense. No more apologizing for a dog who wasn't doing anything wrong. He was going to teach Milo to bark on command. And Cornelia? She would come to dread the very sound she thought she heard all along. What started as nuisance complaints was about to turn into a very noisy, very strategic campaign. And Milo? He was about to become the best actor in the neighborhood. Brian Morris wasn't an impulsive man. He wasn't the kind to jump into conflict or stir up drama for sport. But the relentless accusations and mounting frustration had finally nudged him into a corner. And from that corner, a plan was forming, one that would turn passive aggression into poetic justice. When the package arrived, Brian opened it with the careful precision of someone unpacking a long-awaited puzzle piece. Inside, nestled in molded plastic, was a small, inconspicuous device. No larger than a TV remote, the button-activated bark emitter was sleek, unmarked, and simple. Alongside it came a compact collar-shaped speaker, pre-programmed with an array of realistic dog barks. Everything from a low growl to a full-blown frenzy. It was everything he needed and more. But Brian wasn't about to rush the execution. If this was going to work, it had to be flawless. Predictable patterns would blow his cover. Overuse would dull its effect. He needed Cornelia to truly believe that Milo had suddenly become worse than ever, and that her very presence triggered his barking. The first phase of the plan began with training. Brian attached the speaker collar to Milo, not for any discomfort but to give the illusion of legitimacy. The collar was light and harmless, barely noticeable beneath Milo's thick golden fur. The dog didn't mind it one bit. In fact, he wore it with the same casual indifference with which he wore everything. To Milo, it was just another accessory, like the tennis balls he liked to carry or the sunglasses Ellie had once tried to make him wear. Each day, Brian began pairing the button-triggered bark with visual cues. When Milo saw someone approach the house, especially Cornelia, Brian would casually press the button, releasing a single sharp bark. Then he'd follow up with a treat and a pet. At first, Milo looked confused. The bark wasn't his, but it was coming from his body. Still, treats were treats, and it didn't take long for the dog to associate Cornelia's presence with reward. In a matter of days, Brian had conditioned Milo to perk up and look expectantly toward the sidewalk whenever she came into view. From there, Brian refined the game. He studied Cornelia's patterns. Her morning walks were routine, always between 8:30 and 8:45, wearing the same white visor and holding the same folded newspaper like a scepter of authority. She rarely made eye contact with anyone but always slowed her pace when passing the Morris house, as if waiting for proof of her fabricated complaints. And Brian gave it to her. Each time she passed, a sharp bark rang out, sometimes short, sometimes drawn out, sometimes even followed by a second, louder burst. Brian made sure the window was cracked just enough to let the sound escape without being too obvious. From the outside, it sounded natural, organic, like a dog reacting to someone it disliked. Cornelia would flinch, look toward the house. Sometimes she'd mutter to herself. Other times, she'd scribble something onto a notepad. Brian, watching from inside, resisted the urge to smile. She was convinced. Her fantasy had become her reality. But the beauty of the plan wasn't just in the sound. It was in the consistency. Brian never triggered the barking at random. He used it sparingly only when she was present. He avoided weekends, avoided guests, avoided any pattern that might give it away. It was always just enough to remain believable, just enough to keep her on edge. And the timing couldn't have been better. That week, the HOA had begun discussions about a new round of community improvements. Pet behavior was a hot topic, driven largely by Cornelia's complaints, which had begun spilling beyond private letters and into public forums. She was actively campaigning for new HOA regulations, noise monitoring, bark decibel limits, even pet behavior evaluations. But her credibility was already fragile. The animal control reports had all come back clean. And now, her continued insistence that Milo was a nuisance animal was starting to wear thin with the other board members. Brian's plan turned that pressure dial up one notch at a time. By week 2, Cornelia's frustration began to bleed into the open. She stopped waving to neighbors. Her walks became less frequent. When she did venture out, she began crossing the street earlier, avoiding the Morris house entirely. Brian still triggered a bark or two when she passed, just to keep the illusion alive. But by then, Milo didn't need the speaker anymore. He had begun to pick up the pattern himself. Cornelia meant tension. Cornelia meant stimulation. And without any aggression, without any true barking disorder, Milo began to bark on his own, lightly, eagerly, in the exact moments that Brian used to trigger. It was the perfect outcome. And yet, Brian didn't stop. The device remained hidden. The remote stayed in his pocket. And Milo, now conditioned to bark at Cornelia's mere scent, took over the operation himself. The beauty of the plan was that it folded in on itself. The fake barking trained the dog to bark for real, strategically, playfully, and only when it would matter most. And because it was natural now, no one could say a word. Cornelia, meanwhile, was unraveling. She had begun writing daily posts on the HOA message board, complaining about a coordinated campaign of canine aggression. Neighbors rolled their eyes. Some even mocked her in private. Screenshots of her rants started circulating among residents. One neighbor jokingly offered to get her noise-canceling headphones. Another posted a meme about ghost barking. But Brian stayed silent. He never taunted, never retaliated in public. He let the story tell itself. Cornelia had built a fiction and clung to it for months. Brian simply made it come true. Now, every time she stepped out of her house, she heard exactly what she had imagined from the beginning. A dog that couldn't stand her. And that, Brian thought, was justice served. Not with anger, but with sound. As the third week unfolded, the once quiet streets of Willow Creek were beginning to buzz. Not with barking, but with whispers. Something was changing. Something subtle. And it wasn't just Cornelia who noticed. The Homeowners Association had been mostly indifferent when Cornelia's complaints first began. After all, every neighborhood had its share of chronic complainers. People who seemed to take personal offense at misplaced garbage bins or slightly overgrown hedges. But as her accusations against Brian's dog continued and became more public, the board members started to pay closer attention. Not because they believed her, but because her volume was impossible to ignore. Her posts on the HOA's internal message board had grown increasingly erratic. She now referred to the Morris home as a disturbance zone and described Milo as a menacing presence with antisocial tendencies. She even claimed that the dog waited in ambush for her walks, an accusation so dramatic it bordered on theatrical. And yet, as absurd as her posts were, they were being noticed. Enough pressure eventually forces movement, even from reluctant institutions. And so, under the guise of routine observation, the HOA initiated a series of impromptu neighborhood walkthroughs. Brian noticed the change immediately. Board members he barely recognized suddenly strolled past his house in pairs, clipboards in hand, eyes shifting from mailbox height to lawn edges to, most noticeably, his front yard. First, Brian was cautious. He paused the bark triggering entirely, removing the collar from Milo and stashing the remote deep in a drawer. For a few days, things were quiet, peaceful. Cornelia still scowled from across the street, but with no bark to support her accusations, her message grew weaker. Brian wanted to see what the HOA would do in the absence of noise. Would they recognize the pettiness of her vendetta? Or would they double down, desperate to enforce control? The answer came sooner than he expected. On a crisp Thursday morning, a formal letter was tucked into Brian's mailbox. It was stamped with the HOA seal and bore the stiff language of policy enforcement. The letter stated that multiple reports had been filed regarding pet disturbances originating from his property. While no formal action was being taken, the board strongly advised Brian to ensure his animal's behavior remains in accordance with community guidelines. No citation, no proof, just a warning, a polite threat, hidden behind layers of diplomatic wording. Brian read the letter twice, then folded it carefully and placed it on his desk. It wasn't surprising. He had anticipated this. What was surprising, though, was what followed just days later. A second letter. This one less vague. It stated that the board had received audio evidence of repeated barking during specific times of day, times that suspiciously aligned with Cornelia's morning walks. The implication was clear. The HOA was no longer taking her word alone. Someone was now gathering evidence. Brian felt the air tighten. He had known the HOA could overreach. That was the nature of the beast. But now they were escalating based on recordings. Probably phone audio. Perhaps even surveillance footage. The kind of evidence that can't truly be verified, but which sounds convincing enough when paired with persistent complaint. He paced for a while in his study, considering his options. He could lawyer up. He could submit his own recordings, proof that Milo was calm, docile, and reactive only under provocation. But that would drag him into the weeds, into their arena, or he could stay the course. He pulled the barking collar back out, dusted it off, and placed it on the counter. This wasn't defeat. It was a shift in strategy. A reminder that if they were going to push forward with hearsay and drama, he could meet them with something far more tactical. He reviewed the HOA's bylaws once more, highlighting the sections that dealt with noise, nuisance, and pets. The definitions were, as expected, vague and subjective. There were no decibel thresholds. No formal complaint process beyond repeated reporting. It was a system built to protect the perception of peace, not actual justice. But that was fine. Brian had never planned to play fair. That night, under the cover of quiet, he installed a motion-activated outdoor camera on his porch. Not to record Milo, but to track who was recording him. The next morning, the device captured exactly what he suspected. Cornelia, dressed in her usual walking gear, pausing across the street and holding her phone at an upward angle, aimed directly at his home. She stood there for 15 seconds, turned, and walked away. The camera even captured a low muttering sound, the beginnings of a bark on her phone playback, played loud enough to suggest it came from his yard. It was manipulation, obvious, desperate. But Brian didn't react. Not yet. Instead, he used the footage to tweak his routine. He began walking Milo at alternate hours. He trained him to sit silently when Cornelia was near. He even played recordings of ambient neighborhood noise during her walk window, just loud enough to mask any genuine barking that might slip out. And during the rest of the day, he resumed button-activated barking, but only when Cornelia wasn't home. It was a campaign of confusion, a chess game of sound and silence. And it worked. Soon, the HOA's letters grew more erratic. One claimed he was causing sporadic barking, while another admitted there was no concrete proof of rule violations. The messages became toothless. Brian printed them all, labeled them, filed them into a folder marked countermeasures. But it was the last message that confirmed everything. A new email, this time from a neighbor on the HOA board. Informal, quietly sympathetic. They'd seen the footage Brian had captured. They'd seen Cornelia's behavior. And while they couldn't say anything publicly, the tide was turning. The board was beginning to suspect that Cornelia wasn't a victim at all. She was the aggressor. By the start of the 4th month, the war between Brian and Cornelia had evolved beyond two neighbors. It had become something else entirely. Something broader, quieter, and far more complex. A ripple of tension spread down the tree-lined streets of Willow Creek, coiling through cul-de-sacs and creeping into backyard whispers. The kind of conflict that didn't need shouting to be heard. All it needed was silence between words, and glances exchanged during block walks. What had begun as a one-sided campaign from Cornelia, fueled by petty grievances and phantom barking, was now forcing the neighborhood to pick a side. Not publicly, of course. Not overtly. But the division was there, unmistakable. It started with simple changes. Neighbors who used to wave politely at Cornelia began crossing the street before passing her home. Families who had once taken her side during HOA meetings now stayed silent during her complaints. The HOA board, too, had grown colder. Her emails, once answered within hours, now sat for days. Her once rapid calls for emergency action were now met with bureaucratic delay. But while her influence waned, Brian's quietly grew. The recordings he had captured of Cornelia's phone aimed suspiciously at his home, combined with the documented evidence of compliant noise levels, Milo's clean behavioral record, and the increasingly performative nature of Cornelia's walk routines, gave Brian the power of truth. Not legal power, not yet, but social leverage. And in a community like Willow Creek, that was more potent than any HOA fine. Neighbors started approaching him more freely. At first, it was a brief comment during lawn work. "He's such a sweet dog. I never hear him." Then it evolved into something more. An elderly couple next door, the Parkers, left a note in his mailbox thanking him for being patient with the noise nonsense. A young mother on the opposite corner asked if her kids could meet Milo, having heard from others how gentle he was. Soon, Brian began hosting short play sessions in his yard. Word spread. The dog wasn't the menace Cornelia claimed. He was, in fact, the opposite. The unspoken referendum had begun. And Cornelia? She was losing. Still, she didn't back down. She couldn't. To relent now would be to admit she had been wrong. And for people like Cornelia, there was no such thing as being wrong, only being misunderstood or worse, unappreciated. Her morning walks became more theatrical. She clutched her phone like a weapon, stopping frequently near Brian's yard. When no barking occurred, she would linger, waiting, recording, narrating under her breath. But Milo never reacted. Not on his own. Only when Brian pressed the button. And only at very specific times, once in a while when Cornelia passed with just enough people around to witness the aftermath. The dog's barking, crisp and sudden, echoed from the porch like a firecracker. Predictably, Cornelia would spin on her heels, phone raised, recording again. To anyone watching, it looked suspicious, almost staged, especially since the barking only ever occurred near her, never with anyone else. The neighborhood began to notice. A story began to form, not one written down but understood, whispered in shared drives and behind closed doors. There was something off about her behavior, and with each passing week, Brian's deliberate patience paid off. Not just with the dog's training, but with how he conducted himself. Calm, friendly, cordial at every opportunity. He greeted everyone, offered help with yard work, made no mention of the drama unless asked directly, and even then, offered only measured responses. No complaints, no exaggerations. That contrast worked in his favor, because where Cornelia was obsessed with control, Brian showed restraint. And that restraint, paradoxically, made him more powerful. Eventually, an unspoken line was crossed. At the monthly HOA meeting, Cornelia once again raised the issue of the barking dog on Willowbend. But this time something changed. The board chair, Mr. Ellis, interrupted her. He acknowledged the previous reports. He confirmed that investigations had found no violations. He reminded the attendees that any further grievances must be accompanied by substantiated, verifiable evidence, not just personal recordings or anecdotal descriptions. Cornelia's face, for once, showed genuine confusion. The floor she stood on, once so secure, so unchallenged, was now fragile, cracked. She left the meeting early, clutching her binder like a shield, her usual smirk replaced with silence. From that moment on, her routine changed. She still walked the same path, still clutched her phone, but she no longer lingered, no longer barked back, figuratively or literally. And most importantly, she stopped complaining. Brian, however, continued to play his role with precision. The barking collar remained active, not constantly, but just enough. A few controlled barks every other day. Just enough to keep the tension alive. Just enough to remind Cornelia she had no control anymore. Because what haunted people like her wasn't the noise. It was the fact that the noise didn't obey them. Milo, unaware of the politics swirling around him, simply enjoyed his growing fan base. Treats from passing joggers, gentle pats from children, extra walks, new smells, and more tail wags than ever. By the time summer reached its peak, the war had quieted. Not ended, but shifted. Brian hadn't destroyed Cornelia. He had rendered her powerless. And in a neighborhood governed by the illusion of power, that was worse. In the weeks that followed Karen's latest escalation, something shifted in Mark. It wasn't defeat. It wasn't even frustration anymore. It was clarity. The animal control visits, the security footage, the angry letters. All of it had unveiled a single persistent truth. Karen wasn't simply bothered by noise. She was obsessed with control. And now, Mark had no intention of caving to it. Up until now, he had played defense. He'd tried to accommodate her. He'd tried to be polite. He'd tried to reason. But none of it mattered. Reason didn't work with someone who created problems just to feel powerful. It was time to play offense, but smartly and within the rules. It started with research. Mark pored over animal behavior forums, training videos, and even a few obscure dog psychology blogs. His goal wasn't to silence Bear. It was to control his bark. To turn what Karen saw as a nuisance into a perfectly calibrated tool. Within days, he had a training plan in motion. Bear, like most German Shepherd mixes, was a quick learner. Loyal, eager to please, and intelligent. He quickly picked up on new commands. Mark used clicker training and reward-based reinforcement to associate a specific phrase, speak, with a single bark. Then he added a hand signal. And finally, a small remote-operated clicker that emitted a tone Bear recognized from training. Within 2 weeks, Mark could silently press a button in his pocket, and Bear would let out a single bark, clear, sharp, and controlled. It was a remarkable transformation. Bear had gone from an occasional spontaneous barker to a precision instrument of noise. One bark on cue. No more, no less. But Mark wasn't finished yet. He set up a schedule. He noted Karen's walking patterns, the time she left for her morning power walk, the route she took when she dragged her yappy Pomeranian around the cul-de-sac, the exact moment she paused at the corner of his lawn to look for things to complain about. It was clockwork. She was as predictable as the sun. And so, each morning, just as Karen passed the edge of his property line, Bear would bark once. Just once. Loud and clear. Mark never stood at the window. He never looked outside. He didn't need to. The sound of Karen's angry mutters drifting back toward her house was enough. Then, each afternoon, as she returned from her HOA errands or grocery store runs, the timing would reset. Another precise bark. A friendly reminder. A quiet nudge. It wasn't aggressive. It wasn't illegal. It was just enough. And it drove her mad. She began to slow down in front of his house more often. Sometimes she'd pretend to tie her shoe. Sometimes she'd pace. She started glancing around, scanning windows, trying to catch someone, activating the dog. But she never could. There were no visible cues, no one outside, no way to prove it. Karen started logging the barks. Mark knew this because the HOA president, Jim, an overworked, disinterested man who just wanted to retire in peace, dropped by one day holding a spreadsheet. Apparently, Karen had begun submitting official bark logs to the HOA. Every time Bear barked, she recorded the time and date. According to her, the barks were targeted psychological warfare. Jim, barely holding back a chuckle, explained that while the HOA took complaints seriously, there was no actual violation to enforce. Dogs bark, especially once or twice a day. There was no city noise ordinance being broken. No pattern of disturbance that qualified as harassment. And the logs? They only made Karen look unhinged. Mark thanked him and nodded politely. But inside he smiled. The next phase of his plan was more passive but equally effective. He began installing small sound baffles in the backyard, foam-lined barriers that reflected Bear's bark slightly toward the sidewalk. He made sure they were artfully placed, almost like modern landscaping features. The sound projection wasn't extreme, just enough to give the bark a satisfying presence near Karen's favorite spots to hover. To everyone else, the single bark was background noise. But to Karen, it was a spotlight, a siren, a declaration of independence. Her obsession deepened. She began walking different routes but would still find her way near Mark's home, hoping to hear the bark again. She stopped by other neighbors' houses to ask if they were disturbed by Bear. Most weren't even aware he barked. She filed another complaint, this time with animal control again, citing targeted acoustic manipulation. The officer who showed up had been there before. After a brief inspection and finding nothing unlawful, he shook his head and mumbled something about people having too much time on their hands. Mark didn't even have to speak. Bear sat obediently by the door, tail wagging, silent as a statue. With each passing day, Karen's grip on the neighborhood's patience wore thinner. And Mark? He continued his routine. Press, bark, smile. The game had changed. What once had been a neighbor war of passive aggression had now become something more refined, tactical, calculated, and oddly satisfying. And Karen had no idea what was coming next. As the summer dragged on and Karen's routine became increasingly erratic, a curious shift began to ripple through the neighborhood. At first, it was subtle, just quiet conversations exchanged during lawn watering or quick waves between driveways. But over time, something undeniable had settled in the air around Willow Creek. People were starting to notice Karen. Not in the way she wanted to be noticed. Not as the so-called defender of HOA principles or the guardian of property values. But as something else entirely, the source of the problem. For years, Karen had operated in the shadows of polite suburbia. Her complaints, while frequent, were often swallowed by silence or brushed aside by homeowners who just wanted to avoid conflict. She'd taken aim at trash cans left out too long, lawns cut an inch too high, Halloween decorations that lingered into November. But nothing galvanized the neighborhood's attention like her crusade against Bear. Bear, the quiet, sweet-natured, once occasional barker, was now, thanks to her obsession, the most talked-about dog in Willow Creek. And the community was turning. It started when one of Mark's neighbors, an older woman named Mrs. Halpern, stopped him during his morning walk with Bear. She had noticed something odd. Bear only barked when a certain person walked by. "It's almost like he knows she's coming," she said with a smirk. "Smart dog." Mark didn't confirm or deny. He simply smiled, and Bear wagged his tail, clueless but happy to receive the attention. The word spread from porch to porch, lawn to lawn. Neighbors began quietly observing the pattern. Some even stood at their windows or took their own walks during Karen's usual routes just to witness the moment. The single bark, her flinch, her dramatic head turn, her desperate, failing attempt to catch the trigger. And the irony? The barking, which she claimed was unbearable, became a community-wide inside joke. Kids started jokingly saying "Karen's coming" whenever a dog barked. A teenager down the block edited a sound clip of Bear's bark into a meme that made its way onto the local neighborhood app. One dad even jokingly installed a motion-activated speaker that played a barking sound when people passed his mailbox. Not loud, but enough to get a few chuckles. But for Karen, it was humiliation. Everywhere she went, she felt watched. Not by cameras, but by neighbors. By the very people she had once subtly manipulated with complaint letters and HOA citations. Their stares weren't hostile, but they were knowing. Her power, once enforced through silence and deference, was dissolving in the light of exposure. The more she pushed, the more isolated she became. She filed yet another HOA complaint, this time accusing Mark of coordinating harassment through auditory stimuli. The board, already weary of the feud, refused to act on it. One member even advised her, off the record, to consider letting it go. Then came the ultimate blow, the new neighbor barbecue. Organized by a couple who had just moved in at the far end of the street, the event was meant to be a welcoming, low-key social gathering. Every household received an invite except Karen. At first, Mark didn't know this. But during the event, as neighbors shared lemonade and grilled burgers, several people casually brought it up. She wasn't invited, someone whispered, because she filed a complaint when they had moving boxes on their lawn for too long. The exclusion wasn't orchestrated. It was organic. Karen had, over time, made herself unwelcome. As children played with Bear in the yard, throwing balls and laughing when he gave his one trained bark, Mark stood back and realized something profound. He hadn't just trained Bear to bark on command. He had accidentally exposed something that had long festered in silence. The quiet tyranny of one neighbor's obsession. And now, with the support of the community rising gently but unmistakably around him, The war had entered its final act. Karen was no longer feared. She was no longer believed. She was simply pitted. But her obsession had not burned out yet. No, Karen was planning something. Something bigger. And Mark would be ready. If there was one thing Karen couldn't stand more than the sound of a barking dog, it was the loss of control. And now, she felt it slipping through her fingers. Like sand in a storm. Her complaints fell on deaf ears. Her presence, once enough to make neighbors straighten their mailboxes and hide their trash bins, now drew forced smiles and silent avoidance. Even the HOA board, once sympathetic to her nitpicking, had begun to distance itself from her. But Karen wasn't the type to retreat quietly. With humiliation mounting and Bear's bark becoming a daily, unavoidable reminder of her defeat, she did what serial rule enforcers do when ignored. She went for the nuclear option. She decided to rewrite the rules. Karen's plan was bold, bureaucratic, and drenched in passive aggression. She began drafting an amendment to the Willow Creek HOA bylaws, one that would implement strict auditory limits on domestic animals. She couched the language in concern for mental health, quiet enjoyment, and community serenity. The proposed policy would enforce a multi-tiered response system, starting with citations and escalating to fines, hearings, and possible pet removal for repeated offenses. But what stood out, what made her intentions obvious, was the specificity. Dogs who barked habitually at predictable times would be classified as trained disturbance agents. A term so absurd, even the HOA secretary did a double-take reading it. Still, Karen was thorough. She began canvassing homes under the guise of protecting community peace. She went door to door, dressed in her HOA volunteer polo, clipboard in hand, handing out forms and pre-filled support letters. She hoped that by tapping into the neighborhood's residual respect for order, she could rebuild her crumbling influence. But she hadn't accounted for one thing. The neighborhood had changed. Where once fear and politeness kept people compliant, now there was awareness. People had seen the pettiness for what it was. They had witnessed Karen's obsession, and more importantly, they had seen Mark's response. Calm, measured, clever, legal, respectful. The silent majority had been awakened. Mark caught wind of the bylaw amendment within days. A neighbor dropped a copy of the draft proposal in his mailbox, accompanied by a sticky note that read, "Thought you should see this before it becomes law." Mark wasn't surprised. He had expected something. But this was a gift. He didn't panic. Instead, he activated the next phase of his strategy. It wasn't about retaliation anymore. It was about exposure. Full, undeniable public exposure. He began collecting statements from neighbors, emails, texts, even recorded video snippets, testimonies of Karen's years of minor vendettas. He documented the times she had complained about children's sidewalk chalk, late Halloween decorations, patriotic lawn flags, wind chimes, bird feeders, improperly parked bicycles, and yes, even artificial tulips that didn't match the seasonal tone. Then he compiled a timeline, a full breakdown of every complaint she had lodged against Bear, matched against video surveillance, timestamps, and weather reports proving Bear had been inside or silent for most of them. He included the animal control reports and the officer's dismissive findings. Finally, he attached the HOA's own bylaws and guidelines, highlighting Karen's proposed changes in fluorescent yellow, pointing out where her draft contradicted existing policy, and even referencing city and state animal rights protections she was attempting to bypass. Mark didn't just send this to the HOA. He sent it to the entire neighborhood. He formatted it as a clean, non-aggressive PDF titled, "Page Facing Up, Proposed Noise Bylaw Changes and What They Mean for You and Your Pets." He shared it via email, printed hard copies for porch drop-offs, and even posted it on the Willow Creek Community Forum. The response was instant. Messages poured in. Residents who had remained silent began sharing their own grievances. A mother of twins wrote that Karen once scolded her toddlers for laughing too loudly in the driveway. A man 3 streets over revealed that Karen had once knocked on his door to complain about his wind spinner being visually overstimulating. The community had tolerated Karen for years, but now her intentions were exposed in black and white. And the HOA? They were caught in the middle. At the next HOA meeting, a routine monthly check-in that usually drew no more than 5 residents, dozens showed up. Folding chairs were dragged from storage. People stood in corners and filled the hallway. They came with pets on leashes, toddlers in tow, and copies of Mark's PDF in hand. Karen arrived early, seated confidently at the front with her stack of proposal documents, clearly expecting validation. But when she turned to address the room, what she saw instead were crossed arms, furrowed brows, and cold stares. The president of the HOA, an exhausted retiree named Cheryl, opened the floor, and before Karen could begin her prepared remarks, another resident raised her hand. Then another, and another. It became a tidal wave of polite but firm opposition. No yelling, no insults, just stories, statements, logic. Karen tried to speak multiple times, but each time someone else calmly countered her points, quoted bylaws, or referenced Mark's packet. Her amendment crumbled under scrutiny. Her carefully chosen language was dissected. Her intentions made clear. After nearly 2 hours of civil resistance, Cheryl sighed, leaned into the microphone, and declared, "The board will not be moving forward with this proposal. It lacks merit and is inconsistent with our community's values." Karen sat frozen. Her final power play, rejected in full public view. She gathered her papers with trembling hands, her expression stiff. Her eyes flicked toward Mark, who sat at the back with Bear quietly lying at his feet. Mark didn't smirk. He didn't gloat. He simply gave a small nod, because this wasn't about one dog anymore. This was about everyone who had lived under a cloud of quiet tyranny for too long. And that cloud had finally lifted. But Karen wasn't finished. Not quite yet. She had one more move. Defeat didn't sit quietly with Karen. After the HOA meeting, she returned home not just embarrassed, but visibly unhinged. The woman who had once patrolled sidewalks with her clipboard held high now closed her blinds. Her daily walks, once clockwork precise, stopped completely. Her lawn, always immaculate to the point of obsession, began to show signs of neglect. Grass went untrimmed, garden edges blurred, decorative rocks slipped from their rigid alignment. But the neighborhood had already moved on. The failed bylaw amendment had done more than expose Karen's vendetta. It had galvanized a sense of community that hadn't existed in years. Front porch conversations grew more common. Neighbors waved with more sincerity. Pets played freely in front yards. Children biked past Bear's house, barking in jest, then giggling when Bear answered with his single, trained woof. Karen, meanwhile, became a ghost in her own kingdom. And in her isolation, she spiraled. What began as sulking soon shifted into surveillance. Lights flickered in her windows at odd hours. Occasionally, a shadow was spotted behind her curtains, watching. Cars parked nearby noticed camera flashes from behind the slats. One neighbor said they caught her outside at 2 a.m. taking photos of a wind chime. But nothing came of it until the night of the sprinkler incident. Started just after midnight. Mark had just gone to bed, Bear snoring softly in his crate, when the motion sensor lights in the backyard blinked on. Mark's security camera pinged him on his phone. He opened the app to see a grainy figure hunched near his fence line, gloved hands holding what looked like a long-handled tool. A second later, the figure turned toward the camera, and even through the blur, the identity was unmistakable. Karen. She was tampering with his sprinkler control box. Mark didn't react immediately. Instead, he hit record on the footage and kept watching. She worked for nearly 2 minutes, fiddling with settings, snipping what looked like wiring. Then, she vanished into the shadows. In the morning, Mark found the evidence clearly. The backflow valve cover cracked open, control wires partially severed, and the water flow timer reset to midnight activation. If he hadn't seen the footage, the damage could have gone unnoticed for weeks. But he had seen it, and he had the proof. What Karen didn't realize was that her act of pettiness had crossed into illegality. Tampering with private irrigation systems wasn't just a nuisance, it was vandalism. And given the increasing water restrictions in their county, it could be considered a violation of municipal codes as well. Mark didn't call the police right away. Instead, he made one final, deliberate move. He forwarded the footage to the HOA board, the County Water Commission, and the Neighborhood Watch Coordinator all at once. No commentary, just the time-stamped video, the photos of the damage, and a calm subject line. Backyard tampering, incident reported. The reaction was swift. By afternoon, Cheryl from the HOA called Mark personally, her tone full of concern and disbelief. She informed him that this was no longer an internal matter. A report had been filed with local authorities. An official investigation would follow, and Karen's standing within the HOA was now under review. 2 days later, a squad car pulled into Karen's driveway. No sirens, no spectacle, just a quiet knock at the door, and a long conversation that neighbors watched from behind blinds and porch swings. Karen didn't leave her house for 48 hours after that. But her silence was broken the following Sunday when she finally emerged. Midday, wearing sunglasses and a sun hat, walking stiffly across her lawn with a trash bag in hand. It was her attempt at normalcy, a small gesture to reclaim the dignity that had been drained from her like air from a tire. She moved robotically, avoided eye contact. Her lawn remained unkempt. Her mailbox sagged slightly on its post, as if mimicking her posture. But the neighborhood wasn't cruel. No one jeered. No one gloated. They simply let her be, because the battle was over. Karen had reached the bottom of her spiral, and there was no further to fall. Bear, meanwhile, returned to his usual schedule. Napping on the porch, barking once when someone passed, and receiving head pats from delivery drivers and neighbors alike. Mark repaired the sprinkler box the following weekend. And when a few neighbors offered to help, he thanked them with lemonade and grilled hot dogs. They joked about starting a Dog of the Month club, with Bear as the honorary first member. The HOA, newly motivated, began reviewing several outdated policies. Community meetings were now well attended. Residents offered suggestions, volunteered for committees, and even organized a fall fair. What had started as a single targeted complaint had transformed into something rare in suburbia: unity. Karen, once the self-appointed gatekeeper of silence and symmetry, had unintentionally taught Willow Creek a lesson in resilience. And now, she faded quietly into the background. But the final chapter of this saga wasn't about Karen anymore. It was about how the neighborhood chose to remember it, and how Bear became more than just a dog. He became a symbol of peaceful rebellion, and the loudest bark for fairness this quiet street had ever heard. The conflict that had once defined Willow Creek gradually faded into neighborhood folklore, passed around over block parties, whispered at backyard barbecues, and laughed over during evening walks. But while the bark-fueled battle with Karen had ended, the legacy it left behind continued to shape the rhythm of the community, and Bear, unintentionally, had become something of a local legend. People started calling it the bark herd around the block, a nickname born half in jest, but grounded in the very real impact Bear had on the neighborhood. Mark never intended to become a figurehead for community resistance. He was just a man trying to enjoy a peaceful life with his dog. But after everything that happened, the complaints, the fake citations, the viral HOA showdown, and even the quiet surveillance, his home had become a symbol of patience and clever persistence. And Bear? He was no longer just Mark's pet. He was the dog that outlasted Karen. Every day, Bear lounged on the porch, tail thumping lazily, head resting between his paws. Children often ran up to greet him. Neighbors tossed him treats or gave a friendly rub behind the ears. He responded to them all with affection and, when prompted by Mark's subtle command, a single bark that echoed with quiet pride. The barking collar, still activated by a discreet button, was rarely used now. Mark didn't need to prove anything anymore. But he kept it nearby, not out of spite, but as a memento, a small plastic symbol of the power of calm defiance, of knowing when to bark and when to wait in silence. What truly surprised Mark was how the community had changed after the feud. The experience had broken down invisible walls between neighbors. Where before there had been polite nods and occasional small talk, now there were real connections. Weekly coffee meetups sprang up. Porch visits became frequent. Residents began organizing communal projects, a shared garden plot, a mural for the park, a dog-friendly trail behind the cul-de-sac. Even the HOA transformed. The board brought in new members, introduced transparent policies, and invited community feedback on future decisions. Gone were the days of quiet enforcement and vague language. In their place stood open dialogue and accountability. Karen remained in the neighborhood, but she had stepped away from the board. Her presence became more like background noise, visible but powerless. She no longer glared across the street. She no longer watched from behind curtains. She kept to herself, and slowly, the obsession that had once consumed her seemed to dissipate. No one harassed her. No one retaliated. The community didn't stoop to her old tactics. They simply moved forward, leaving her to her silence. And perhaps, in her own way, Karen learned something too. But for Mark, the experience left him with a deepened sense of gratitude. What had begun as an infuriating injustice evolved into an opportunity, not just to stand up for himself, but to help others realize they didn't have to live under the weight of petty authority. He had won not by yelling or retaliating in anger, but by understanding the rules better than those who tried to wield them unfairly. And then, with a clever plan and a loyal dog by his side, turning the situation into a quiet, effective, and unforgettable statement. On the one-year anniversary of the first complaint, Mark threw a small celebration. He called it Bear's Barkiversary. Dozens of neighbors showed up. There were dog treats, lawn games, burgers on the grill, and even a hand-painted banner that read, "Let the good barks roll." Children wore paw-print face paint. Someone brought cupcakes shaped like bones. Bear, of course, wore a bandana that said, "Neighborhood Watchdog." As the sun set on the gathering, Mark stood quietly at the edge of the lawn, watching the scene unfold. Laughter, conversation, kids running barefoot through grass. Bear dozed contentedly under a shady tree, ears twitching as his name floated through the air like a song. Mark smiled. He thought about everything that had happened. The frustration, the ridiculousness, the late-night footage, the HOA meeting, and, most of all, the day he realized his dog could be trained to bark at just the right moment, and how that single, strategic bark had set a chain reaction in motion that not only silenced injustice but gave his neighborhood its voice back. It wasn't about revenge. Not anymore. It was about resolution, community, connection, and a dog who proved that sometimes the loudest stand you can take only takes one bark.